Hey class, Dr. Doug Brown here. Welcome to week 7. Almost finished with the course. You're doing a fantastic job. Thank you for going the extra mile in the discussions and our essay. Hopefully the feedback that I've given you on those have been helpful. If not, please make sure that you take a look at those when you have time. So what did we do last week? We learned a little bit about the declaration process of emergencies. Disasters, especially. Remember that not all disasters are Stafford Act disasters. Those large-scale disasters where you see FEMA come in, those disasters are typically Stafford Act disasters. And what has to happen with those, again, not every one is a Stafford Act disaster. Some are local and state. So for it to be a Stafford Act disaster, a lot of factors involved there in that the majority of the people can't have insurance. They've got to meet a poverty level, the U.S. poverty level requirements. And the local and state resources can't afford to pay for, can't fund that disaster. So when a lot of outside resources come in, the price of the disaster increases, and once that, it just overwhelms the local and state resources, and those other resources come in from the federal government or other state via the Emergency Management Assistance Compact, which we didn't get to talk a lot about. Then the Stafford Act may be able to kick in and help fund that disaster and reimburse the state and local government as well as some of the non-governmental organizations for the work that they've done. But again, that depends on a lot of factors. Depends on if a lot of people have insurance or the risk, the hazard that has affected them. Well, they have that insurance and they can pay for whatever damage it's occurred, then there's no need for the federal government to come in. But a lot of people can't, especially those that are at or below the federal poverty level. They don't have adequate insurance or renters, etc. Then they don't have any way to get reimbursed. There's no insurance there, and that's when sometimes those thresholds are so high in that $6 million range where federal assistance can be provided. We're seeing that in California right now, where a lot of renters are out and they don't have the ability to get any reimbursement any other way. They didn't have any insurance, so the federal government is kicking in some of those cases to help out. This week we're talking about terrorism. I know that's a hot item. It still is. It's sort of cooling down a little bit, but you see it on the news every day. We'll talk a little bit about international terrorism. Some of the things that's happened with some of those international terrorism groups, as well as some of those threats to both internationally and domestically that affect the United States. And we have those homegrown terrorists, those extremist groups that we see. That's a huge concern anymore, and it seems to be growing in the background. A lot of groups out there, and then this week I've included some resources and links for you to take a look at those. But it seems that although we have the outside groups such as Hezbollah, Boko Haram, and also the remnants of what's left of ISIS, Al Qaeda, that affect the United States and our interest abroad, encouraging people here locally to carry out acts of terrorism. That continues, but those homegrown terrorist groups are, like I said, they're really in the background, and they're moving forward and they're building up whatever it is they're doing. Now, the FBI, Homeland Security investigations, some of the other federal agencies are watching them, and they have their eye on them. So there's been a lot of arrests. It seems here locally there was about 70 people arrested. That was part of a white supremacist group. They were doing some gun running, drug trade, human trafficking, etc., to make money and fund their operations. It was a huge deal. Lots of arrests, including some pretty well-known people here locally. So those investigations and watching those groups do continue. What are we reading this week? Chapters 10, 11, and 12 in our textbook, and then we have a video as well as a link there at terrorism.com. Takes a little bit for that to load. You'll see some instructions on exactly what to look for going to the group profile tab. Now in the resources, you'll see a list of some of the sort of a world fact book that the CIA uses, and they have a lot of information there. I'd encourage you to take a look at that sometimes. You'll see some of those different groups that exist internationally, all of which could have some influence on what happens in the United States. There's no reason to think that they couldn't involve or do something here in the United States. We've seen that, obviously with 9/11, the Boston terrorism group, or attacks, etc. Although the Boston group may have had some influence from these outside terrorist groups, that's considered primarily as a homegrown terrorism, something that happens by our own people in the United States. Why have we not seen more attacks here lately? And I think that's because the FBI, Homeland Security investigations, the CIA, local police, and military, all these groups are working together to combat terrorism and try to prevent some of those different attacks. But that's not to say that they won't occur. We see some different acts, such as what happened in Las Vegas, some of those domestic incidents. We have the, people that live here in the United States, or citizens, would like to call that terrorism, and it is to a degree. But just keep in mind there is a difference between a criminal act that happens and an act of terrorism, and the law defines that. There are some challenges with that law. And there's been sort of a debate about what we should call terrorism, domestic terrorism, that occurs, and make sure that we get people reimbursed, etc. And that was one of my questions last week in the discussions. Does the Stafford Act cover domestic terrorism? That's something to think about. I also included RAND.org, and they have a threat assessment page. I'd encourage you to take a look at that, and maybe use that as a resource to help you move forward. Now, will we see other attacks? Probably. It's likely. Sometimes those things get crossed between those different organizations. Those things do happen. Communication breaks down occasionally, and someone slips through the cracks, and then it's always possible that we could have another terrorism attack, such as one that's perpetrated by terrorist groups outside, such as some of those different influences that we see of ISIS, etc. Although we see that the majority of ISIS has been defeated in the Middle East. If you read some of the other reports, just do some search on the internet, you'll see some of the military leaders, especially those that are retired, who will tell you, no, ISIS is not defeated. There's still more going on, not only in the Middle East, but the threat to the United States continues, and it continues to be an extreme threat that we should continue to watch and monitor. However, as I mentioned, some of those homegrown extremist groups, we see those. We saw what happened in Charlottesville. They can start off small with just some ideology, and then that explodes into some sort of event where we have an attack domestically. It's not so hard to go on the internet and find recipes and directions to make bombs and ricin and that sort of thing. And when you go to this FBI website that I've included, you'll see on the left side of the link some of those different arrests that have been made in some of those incidents that you don't always hear about on the news. We even had one of those here recently over this year, in fact, where a young man locally made some ricin, which is not easy to do. It's made out of castor beans, and it's not really easy to refine that and get it to a point where you can weaponize it, but he apparently had attempted to do so and felt like he was sick. I think it was probably more psychosomatic, and but he reportedly got sick, and he called, self-reported, said, hey, I've made some ricin, I've got a lot of it, and the FBI and the local hazmat team responded out there. It was a city hazmat team, not the one that I serve on. So they were able to go out and mitigate that, clean it up, and test it and deal with it. And they did identify the fact that it was ricin. So some of those things can be done, and obviously some of those threats still exist. This should be a good discussion. I'd encourage you in your discussion this week. What we're doing is go to the terrorism.com site, choose one of the groups listed, describe who they are, and then I want you to discuss a little bit about their ideology. I think that's important to have some understanding of ideology and in some of the tactics that they use, and just help us understand a little bit about what they're all about. Tactics are important because we don't know what those are. It may be that they use social media. It may be used that they try to get their message out. Others try to obviously make bombs and different things. And then again, on the domestic side, we have some of those groups such as ALF, the Animal Liberation Front, that they burn research facilities, they make threats and other things to intimidate some of the researchers, some of the owners, investors, etc. And we actually have one of those incidents here where the Animal Liberation Front came in, did some protests. There was huge arrests, and that's about all they did. They disrupted. Everything was going on, but there was no real other threats that took place other than that. A lot of them went to jail. So dealing with that group was a very interesting thing. I participated in that as part of the special operations group I'm with, and transported some of those people to jail, as well as to seek medical attention. So it's a good discussion this week. I look forward to connecting with you in the discussions. We're almost done. Take a look at week 8 when you get time. Not a lot, not really a big final paper or anything due in the class. Just mainly discussions and an overview. But I do want you to take a look at that, make sure we finish strong, check your grammar, make sure you support what you're doing with those APA citations and references, following the links and examples that I gave you in the announcements. Look forward to the week. Great discussion on terrorism, and I hope you enjoy the week. I'll see you in the discussions, and thanks for taking time to watch the video. It's been exciting. I've enjoyed working with y'all guys. You've worked hard, and I'm proud of all of you. Keep rocking.